Perhaps it had some origins in Winnipeg. It's really fairly old. Do you remember all the words in Winnipeg? But practices would come just show where they were colored and the first state of project. And it was much more informal, those cases that got from comments and especially in the legislature. So it's not a pitchy type of thing. It's just a little bit more in depth.
Was it a yoga?
No, that's actually a little more.
Okay.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
I'm sure she's, they're both very good.
I know Laura.
Boy, right on the street.
So you're still secure in the
West End of Bow, that long battle. Parents I've been to the same place on the happy for we were knocked out for a month.
But we qualify now for the
Crazy 2 months before.
whatever we do get. We better have
I immediately thought it was a band violin.
So it's funny, we never thought it would be 52 years and we did the cars are festive.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
Yeah, okay. Good?
Use that there.
Hey?
I'm like, sorry?
Yeah, you can just
Yeah, let's do that one. A couple of, you know what I'm saying? Sorry? You know what? Yeah, I know.
Okay.
This is wonderful. You got it. And the long term, she gets more excited than she gets. Whatever. So, tell me what you think of test one. We got a lot of time. Yeah, she got it there. Sharp. There it is. Very good. Forest, springs,
Ready?
borderline art. She's in a relationship with a guy called Mark Schwann. And he's 36 years yeah. Well, he's a very famous author. He's great books on Japanese art and stuff. Amazing guy. So, I knew Mark from that point on the academic side. And then kind of a true divergence. You know, when you have two friends from the world. Get some. You guys have been together forever. How long have you been together? Yeah, before the apart. Good.
There's like,
Oh yeah, no, you can't get this.
no, there's like this super little cans on there.
That's what they use.
There's still some seating up front here on the right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to Inform Interiors. Of course, on the unceded traditional lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I just want to take a moment to first acknowledge the Inform staff that organizes and orchestrates this event. Yeah, thank you. Tonight, oh, what did I write my notes? Let's just see here. Tonight, we would like to welcome the West Coast Modern League. This is for their first of 3 events this year here at Inform Interiors. Tonight, we have environmentalists. Oh, what was that? I lost that. Oh, hang on there. I lost my notes. We have environmental Alyssa. I lost my note. Schwann and Laura Killam, architect, environmental artist. Got it. Okay.
Take it away. I missed you.
That's okay.
You weren't in the notes.
Thank you.
No, don't raise it.
No, I don't want to.
Just.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Steve Gairns. I'm an architect here in Vancouver and chair of the West Coast Modern League. I first want to take this opportunity to offer our gratitude to Nancy and Mills Benson for so generously hosting the league this evening. It's been just over 3 years since we were last here, which was mere weeks before the pandemic hit, so we're very grateful to be back in this beautiful space. I also want to thank the whole team here at Inform for all of the work that they have done in putting this evening's event together. We very much appreciate all of your efforts, so thank you very much. So the League is really thrilled to finally be launching this new series that we are calling On the Boards. It's been several years in waiting, and it will become a regular part of the League's annual programming. The focus of this series is on engaging our local designers, and it's intended to provide a platform for them to share their in-progress or recently completed works with the community, and in turn for us to learn about the incredible work and creative endeavors that are being undertaken right here in our own backyard. Tonight we're joined by two incredible designers, Alyssa Schwann and Killam, who are involved in very different kinds of work, but both of whom share in a deep sensitivity to place, to the land or to their sites, and to the relationships between the human and the natural. So just a few words about each of them. Alyssa Schwann is an environmental artist and designer who grew up in northern Saskatchewan. She has been involved in Design International with projects in North America, Europe, and North Africa, and spent several years at the office of West 8 in the Netherlands, focused on parks, gardens, and public spaces. For many years, Alyssa taught environmental design and landscape architecture at the University of Manitoba. Here in Vancouver, she co-directs the Atelier Anonymous Global Landscape Foundation, an organization that specializes in cultural landscapes and community development. Recently, Alyssa has been creating installations in an urban forest here in Vancouver, supported by a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts, and this past summer on an island in Finland, a project she'll be sharing with us this evening. Killam is an architect who grew up balancing life between Vancouver and an off-grid island up the coast of British Columbia. Laura has been an adjunct professor and visiting critic at UBC Sala, taught in the architectural sciences at the BCIT School of Construction, and in the design formation program at Langara College. Bolstered by a background as an architect, exhibition, and film set designer, Laura founded Killam Architecture in 2017, a Vancouver-based practice that strives to create quiet, understated architecture deeply connected to the unique characteristics of its place, and specializing in residential projects on remote and rugged sites along the BC coast. Tonight she'll be sharing a number of these quiet and remote projects with us. So with that, thank you again for coming out tonight, and please join me in welcoming Alyssa Schwann and Killam.
Good evening, and thank you so much to the West Coast Modern League, to Steve and the board for inviting me here tonight. Thank you, Inform, and to all of you for sharing your time with us. Sometimes it's good to start with where we come from, tell that story, but I'm going to skip that and go to the present. Although tonight I am going to speak about my individual and collaborative creative work, I want to mention my involvement with the Atelier Anonymous Global Landscape Foundation, co-founded by myself and Jan Heinrichs in 2015. Our members come from diverse parts of the world and unique life experiences, and we share an interest in the relationship between community development, well-being, and landscape conservation. Members work in India and the Philippines, along with local organizations, indigenous communities, and academic institutions. Sometimes in Canada, for example, community development in the north, which I'll refer to later. Some of the work I'll be showing tonight has to do with trees, a direction of study that started in 2022. But I first need to talk about the forest, metaphorically, the bigger picture to situate the studies. There are three themes that anchor the work: place, learning, and responsibility. How place connects with learning, and with that learning and new knowledge brings a responsibility. And that responsibility connects back to place. And this is my attempt to position the work, trying to create a continual feedback in approach and processes. Maybe it sounds too serious, but these are the weights that I seem to be carrying more and more. That being said, there are many errors along the way. The work is also positioned by a longing to experience landscapes, to feel connected to places on some level, to understand them, even if only for a brief period of time. My work confronts me to reflect on larger questions of belonging to place, and thus learning how to connect to land, because we aren't always taught this, at least I wasn't, and so I've had to learn it. It's an ongoing process, of course. How do we learn from and thereby trust our surroundings? How do we build patience? Patience of self, patience for others, because trust and patience are vital in the reciprocal work I, with colleagues and communities, do to enact change. Within these places that I have sometimes deep or sometimes fleeting memories of, there are some forests. 3 I will expand on, because these places, their histories, and the people connected with them are the seeds of my present. Community development work in the Northwest Territories, situated within a northern boreal forest, a month spent last June on the island of Korpo in Finland, within a dense pine forest, and current studies here in BC in our coastal western hemlock forests. Where we all find ourselves today is invariably informed by our past experiences. In much the same way, we are shaped by our environments, by cultural landscapes. Maybe this is a familiar term. I use place and cultural landscape somewhat interchangeably this evening. But a large part of what shapes a place and our understanding of landscapes is based on everyday elements, or those of cultural significance. A way of life, developed over time, is supported and reinforced by key identifiers, such as trees, sacred vegetation, a landscape dotted with vineyards, or the fragrance of a sagebrush. Such things reinforce our connection to a landscape and place. And sometimes these associations are culturally specific or important to an individual or a community. Associations may be tangible or intangible. Tangible elements of a cultural landscape are often local, small-scale, even non-monumental, perhaps not so interesting things, but they acquire value and meaning by their familiarity. Or they form the significant layers of a history of a place, the physical markers, such as culturally modified trees. Whereas intangible connections might be oral histories, carried between generations, or language or place names. So a cultural landscape is a way of both seeing and being, and it encompasses the idea that society and self are not independent of a place, meaning that we are connected to where we are, and where we are is connected to us. This brings me to a project Jan and I designed in Railtown in Vancouver, commissioned by Bocce in 2014. I bring it up as it was perhaps in retrospect a first grappling with the loss of forest. In the early 20th century, there was an abundant resource of felled wood, some of which was used as paving in Vancouver. A colonial era of urban growth turned the forests into streets clad in wood blocks, later to be encapsulated in layers of asphalt. This area in pink, we were asked to do something with, the zone between the sidewalk and the warehouse renovated by Omer Arbor. We employed charred recycled wood that recalled the historic paving, still partly visible under the facing street where the asphalt has chipped away. And as a reference to the local landscape, kinnikinick and poplars were set within the wood blocks. Initially established as a temporary installation, the work remained in place with the vegetation thriving. It was intended to challenge the idea of permanence versus renewal and ephemerality. It was also a reaction against denaturalized urban landscapes while responding to a colonial era settlement, where the wood blocks themselves decay over time, transforming the sidewalk into a small living corridor, alive with seasons, color, texture, movement, and sound. But this visible erosion of natural materials, a rewilding, if you will, perhaps challenges a conception of landscape that is tidy, static, and polite. It looks messy, they need to get rid of all of that. At least that's what one of my friends told me. And someone must have heard that call for order, and a few months ago replaced everything with bark mulch dyed with iron oxide. Another aspect of place that I want to address is well-being. There is a relationship between access to land and well-being. This I've learned from Indigenous communities, particularly from work with community in Northern Canada. But I first want to set this up. Identity and community were once linked to the land and to natural systems, but now we long for nature. Maybe we establish parks and then claim to save nature. All the while, bit by bit, these vestiges of the natural world are failing. And in the same breath of our reverence for its purity, we talk about ripping into its resources. So as landscape, as nature gets stripped away, society is left to rely on interventions that inject lost or absent greenery in attempts to mitigate environmental and aesthetic damage. The lived experience in the pages of the history books are being ripped out with every change that our environment continues to undergo. And considering the ongoing changes in forests, an endangered relationship needs to be recovered and renewed. Not only are we losing species of plants and animals and altering systems on multiple scales, but we are also compromising diverse cultures and languages. And with each generation, we are experiencing an extinction of knowledge. With every generation, our baseline of understanding about the world around us shifts. Some of us forget what the world used to look and be like. That failure to notice is perhaps somewhat heightened by an extinction of nature experience. For example, having contact with nature affects children, and deep-seated attitudes about it are formed during childhood, and these are unlikely to change in adulthood. Physical accessibility to nature equates with a higher emotional and cognitive understanding about it, because, in part, we become connected to a place by walking the land, by moving through it. But as we're becoming less and less aware of nature, arguably we are losing those connections. Therefore, will we continue to see nature as relevant? The question becomes how we can retain a sense of wonder for the natural world, because after all, we protect what we love. Further, interaction with nature or connection to the land is as vital as social interaction is for community and individual well-being. And this takes me to well-being that is tied to a specific place. In the last 30 years, there's been a growing recognition of the importance of a high-quality, built natural environment for social, cultural, and economic well-being. But the question is, how actually do we define well-being, and whose concepts of well-being are being prioritized? Sarah Dage and I have developed a community well-being framework we apply to our work, and the framework integrates a kind of sentiment analysis, basically an analysis of community information that includes in-depth interviews, workshops, and methodical review of planning documents. And then we pair that with a benchmarking exercise, a kind of gaps analysis, using rigorously developed criteria, building from what was learned from community. And then from there, we work with community to develop a cultural and place-specific well-being framework. The outcome of this work is that it enables communities to strategically prioritize their needs, allocate their resources, and apply for funding. This hasn't been published yet, but I'll illustrate our work with the tribal government and the NWT on infrastructure development using this framework. If we first consider the state of infrastructure in the north, historically the designed built environment has failed northern Indigenous communities. There's an ongoing crisis, housing shortfalls, food insecurity, a lack of health services, disruption and transmission of culture, just for starters. However, beyond isolating the infrastructure gaps and then making a strategy around those gaps, which is more of a conventional approach, we wanted to first understand how a community defined infrastructure. So the standard definition of infrastructure aligns with basic structures and processes that are necessary to support the operation of the community: roads, fire, protection, water, and the like. But people in communities may have a slightly different definition of what infrastructure means to them. It's not singular, of course, but in the community we worked with, infrastructure was defined as something which protects and promotes culture. They expressed that it is rooted in providing access to land-based activities and local resources, thereby supporting cultural practices to achieve cultural revitalization. So how does well-being fit into this? There's a connection between infrastructure development and community and individual well-being, and this became clear. We began speaking to community about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a hierarchy they had themselves been looking at, where the first priority is physiological needs, and everything then builds from there. But it became clear that through discussions that this was not actually wholly applicable as a foundation. Because for this community, cultural needs actually were the most important. Without culture, nothing else is possible. People cannot be healthy, they cannot heal, and they cannot be economically self-sufficient. So for successful infrastructure to be implemented in this place, it needs to build from a foundational understanding that development holds an integral relationship with cultural well-being. This changes assumptions on what infrastructure is prioritized and how funding is allocated. The point here is that well-being is a dynamic and culturally and community-specific concept, and it's specific to place. And when a community's values and culture inform how built natural environments are managed, communities can be achieved, and significantly, control and sovereignty can be regained. So what's been learned from places, from cultural landscapes, from communities, this informs the basis of my work. Work that is trying to find a way of looking at nature, specifically the forest. But the work is also significantly influenced through working with others. largely because there's a shared enthusiasm. And enthusiasm, in my opinion, is a big part of learning. When we are enthusiastically engaged with something, when we are doing something in which we're fully immersed, we are on a path of exploration and building knowledge. When I think of enthusiasm, though, I don't think of having a grin on your face where everything's fantastic. This bear may look like he's happy, but he's actually totally stressed. So how I interpret enthusiasm is that it comes more from continually asking, what can I learn from this, and how can I do something differently? And the more information we gain through reciprocal learning, the more knowledge we build, and this often propels inspiration. So this is a beautiful work of porcelain produced by Mike Seymour, with whom I sometimes work. His process uses both molded and natural methods. He's asking about it. But this mixing of natural and fabricated processes is something we are continuing to evolve collectively and independently, including for our Untitled Nest for Owls. This was Richmond's first Art Plus Habitat project, and our 2021 Windflowers public art work also in Richmond. So with these projects, the Nest and Windflowers, there's a certain uncertainty, which is completely freeing. And we're now working together on a garden in Vancouver for Campus Studio, which is infused with making and testing things. It's an immersive process grounded in equal parts rigor and enthusiasm to take creative risks as we move from conceptual ideas through deep details and into realization. Enthusiasm for me is also about finding new solutions in order to come to different outcomes. If we keep doing things the way we've been doing them, the outcome will invariably be the same and nothing will change. Systems won't change. So we have to be courageous and explore new paths. My thinking about the forest has also been motivated by correspondence with Evan Tremblay, a Métis artist and landscape designer based in Winnipeg. We have a reciprocal digital and non-digital inquiry and informal collaboration continuing to evolve through long-distance exchanges about our separate yet conjoined studies of forests, his in Manitoba, mine mostly in BC. In addition to video, recent exchanges loosely and roughly test digital manipulation of photos of forest installations and their translation into non-digital formats, and now we're exploring animation with these. This shifts me into the forests that I've been looking at this past year. First, why I'm interested in the forest. Well, forests hold immeasurable, tangible, and intangible relationships. They are sacred places, connecting past to present to future. They are our history books. The interest also involves the relationships and ongoing changes to the forest ecosystem, taking a mapping discarded materials, or areas that have succumbed to the hostile takeover of introduced species. These pieces lead to a reading of the edges of a forest, its interior, and changes over time, and inform studies that fulfill this on-the-boards theme tonight, because there remain many questions and answers to consider. So what I'm showing is the beginning of something, and I welcome comments. Alluded to already, there are two primary forest type studies. The first located on the island of Korpo in the southern Finnish archipelago. It's heavily forested, not unlike the rest of Finland, but also bears the mark of intensive logging. Though Finnish practices are quite advanced, they are not without controversy. The second biogeoclimatic forest zone that I've been learning more about is the coastal western hemlock forest here in BC. Most of what I show is from Pacific Spirit Park, a second growth forest, for which I have a research permit. Make sure you get one of those. I also want to acknowledge that this work is undertaken on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. While Pacific Spirit Park was established in 1989, Musqueam have occupied this place and maintained their cultural lifeways here since time immemorial. However, the forest markings are not intended as a direct statement on the colonial and divisive history of the park. In the forests, investigations have taken three forms so far: three-dimensional drawings, clearings, and installations informed by forest nurse logs. So these three different methods are in pursuit of the same goal, connecting to place. The acts were not preconceived, but rather have emerged and developed over multiple visits to the forests and time spent listening and observing. They are nascent and incomplete processes, but represent a need to interrogate the future of the forest and our responsibility to that future. I'm going to show more about the clearings and the drawings tonight, and I'll explain first more what I mean by drawings. These drawings in three dimensions explore two definitions of the word. Firstly, draw their order from the positions of the trees on the site, and second, top lines of string resemble lines drawn on paper. The forest markings are drawings that play with and against natural geometries and lines within these forests. Maybe we don't necessarily see them at first. The string might be a continuation of a line, or maybe it connects different parts of a tree, a stump, plant. It's a simple act of linking in a rudimentary manner, but striving for light-handedness. But what for me is interesting is the revealing of a natural order, a regularity or a pattern, something not previously seen. These spatial drawings, using Mason's line, are akin to rapid sketches, usually made in a few hours or less, photographed and then dismantled, with no trace of their existence remaining. They are abstractions, pulling or drawing from and within the forest. An effort to line things up or purposely draw a straight line or parallel lines is neither consciously nor painstakingly done. Rather, the lines reflect and are inherent to natural geometries and emerge from the points of connections nature offers. So in a simple way, the strings begin to reveal a certain order. Of course, biology has lots of patterns if you come close enough or get far away enough. Walking in the forest, it sometimes feels that you're almost coming into a room. Here in Corpo, this grouping of trees felt cathedral-like in their organization. The string was used to simply connect an apex tree to trees seemingly forming an interior space. Then from measurements, I later drew the configuration, the lines of the strings, the dots, the trees, and a kind of floor plan emerges. The installations are site-specific, first engaging at the macro scale the conditions of the broader forest, whether recently disturbed, second growth, or old growth, and second at the micro scale, the specific qualities of an individual tree, branch, pooling of water, or fallen log. Still, it is the rhythms and patterns of nature that structure the drawings. On Corpo, I chose to work on more recently disturbed terrain in the aftermath of logging, where the forest was primarily horizontal. Most of the drawings responded to the order of fallen timber, much like pondering the next move in a game of pickup sticks. The character resulting drawings tend to be flatter, tracing the contour of the ground and the debris left upon it. Although approached with a consistent intention, the dimensions and configuration of the interventions respond to each unique forest condition. Unintentionally, they perhaps become an expression of the qualities of each landscape. Another act in Corpo was of clearing material and debris resulting from logging to take the ground back to its basic contour, uncovering the presence of what once was. The removal of disturbed soil, roots, and moss exposed the granite bedrock buried beneath. As in other works, the resultant forms are drawn from and determined largely by the surroundings. Here the pattern for the clearing emerged from first connecting strigs to stumps on either side of the logging machine track, and the clearings will remain until the natural processes of precipitation, wind, and growth will once again reclaim the land. I enter the forest with no preconception of what will result from being there, nor on an emotional level how I will leave. Slowly, and with each subsequent installation, I came to realize that the works were simultaneously a form of an exchange and a kind of apology. The actions and reactions involved in these studies remind me that although nature long ago made the first move, we decide what follows. Do we protect or control and possibly destroy? Regardless, nature continues to respond. Despite any formal beauty that may or may not result, for me the markings are ultimately about connecting to land and place. Above all, this series of installations demonstrate that I'm an amateur student of the forest, learning about it and still trying to understand it. So to connect the dots, tie the threads. To enact change, we can look towards new ways of understanding and working. This requires seeing places as organisms, as systems, and as a set of relations. And I often think about these words from Richard Wagamese in his book, For Joshua. Sometimes your eyes don't tell you the truth and what's around you. The most important things are hidden, and sometimes you have to learn to see all over again. This is born from the connection to place, fed by well-being, and maintained by mutual learning. Responsibility to do things differently also asks for a duty of care in all that we do, and I think such a duty of care is evident in the work of Alyssa. this piece is speaking next. So thank you for listening, and I welcome any feedback later, or see you down, bye.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Alyssa, for that super inspiring talk. I'd also like to thank the West Coast Modern League for the invitation to speak about our work tonight. And thank you all for your interest and for showing up. I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, and that's very comforting. So Laura Killam Architecture, or LKA, was established in 2017. We specialize in custom homes, frequently for multi-generational clients. And our scope includes master planning raw and wild sites, all the way through planning the architecture into the interiors of the homes. Our projects are situated on the BC coast, most typically on wild sites on remote off-grid islands. Tonight I'm going to speak about 3 of those projects, 2 which were very recently completed and 1 that is on the boards. The 3 projects illustrate the aims and the ethos of the studio. But before I speak about the work, I need to frame the work in context. As Steve mentioned, I grew up in BC, and I have spent most of my life here, much of my life here. A portion of every year since I was born, I have spent on a very tiny island across from Desolation Sound, the British Columbia coast, at my family cabin, and you can see that tiny little speck at the very end of that long meadow. In 1972, in reaction to a proposed development that would have turned the island into a massive resort, Hernando was purchased collectively by 40 families. The ethos for the island was modeled after Sea Ranch, California, which had been in the works in the decade prior, in the 1960s, and I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with that project. The Hernando community has a shared vision to conserve the natural environment, limit development, and build within strict design guidelines so that buildings place second to nature. Some of the early cabins on Hernando were designed or built by familiar names to this crowd. Barry Downs, bit of a poor resolution there, as well as other names like Boat Babiki, Viscous Building Components, my dad, Larry Killam, and Jeffrey Massey, who was instrumental into forming that ethos for the island. This slide shows 2 of my favorite projects in the world, both designed by Jeff Massey, both tiny cabins and both completely discreet and inconspicuous in the landscape. So these early cabins and the ethos of the community were incredibly influential on my life and my work. My practice began with projects on the same island and were designed within the framework of that ethos. In all of our projects, we desire to keep buildings quiet and understated. We use natural materials and simple roof lines and always aim to stitch buildings into the natural setting, whether on Hernando Island, as the 3 projects I'm going to speak to tonight, or on our more recent projects on other islands in the vicinity. A core pursuit of the studio underscoring the work is the aim to engage in a meaningful conversation with the unique character of the site. Our idea of site extends far beyond the physical boundaries and encompasses the experiential and atmospheric. So we consider site to mean the passage of light in the course of a day, the sound of the ocean, winds and breezes, and distant views, as well as the nature of the ground and flora on the site itself. As we're typically operating on wild sites, there's no back of the site, there's no back or front, so we always consider multiple ways of approaching the site, such as the arrival from the forest by bike, or the approach in bare feet from the beach. Working with domestic program in the landscape allows us to be preoccupied with the essential activities of life, such as shelter, bathing, eating, and sleeping in connection to the natural environment. So we can consider things like where is the optimal place for the outdoor shower after an afternoon swim? Where's the best spot to have your morning coffee in the sun while the chill is still in the air from the night before? Where can you find shelter from a westerly breeze? And where can a family come together to eat at magic hour? Another consideration for all of our projects is time. The time it takes for buildings to weather and season into the landscape, so we anticipate that weathering and prefer our projects at least 5 years in when the cedar is silvered. We also think of time in terms of planning for often multi-generational families who are planning for both now and anticipating future needs. And we think of time in terms of the seasonal expansion and contraction of occupants, where there might be 2 people in a cabin in a shoulder season and a full house with a multi-generational family at the peak of summer. So the first project I'm going to speak about tonight is sited on a rock bluff shown here, covered in thick moss and lichen that descends to the sea. There's a 40-foot elevation change from the forest at the high point of the site to the south, to the ocean at the low point of the site to the north. The site enjoys spectacular views to Desolation Sound to the north and the summer sunset to the northwest. In conversation with this rock topography, our response was to step the cabin down the landscape to mediate that elevation land from forest to sea. There are many physical constraints on this site, in particular, such as the bluff that you can see in the topography shown on that site model, a sight line along the western edge of the site, privacy from the neighbor to the east, respecting the setback from the natural boundary of the sea to the north, and all the while trying to provide views out to Desolation Sound. So that resulted in a kind of stepping down of the form and the decks within quite a narrow footprint on the site to fit within all of those constraints. This drawing just tries to describe the atmosphere that the project creates, where we attempted a curated procession through the landscape, where the body rotates with turns at each stair as you descend from the forest to the sea. And as you descend along that procession, framing views to the moss rock landscape and delaying the view to the water and to Desolation Sound. So the drawing shows a site plan revealing the multi-leveled interior at the top right of the page, 2 sections through the site and buildings below that, and a view to Desolation Sound on the left bottom part of the page. All in all, there are 12 levels in this project, but never a full flight of stairs. So as you descend and move through the site, you never feel that experience of making all of the elevation gain as you descend through the house. The project also steps in plan along the sight line, which allowed us to bring in south light all the way through the volumes, all the way down to the north portion of the project. Southern light is also brought in by a long ridge beam skylight that animates the entry and circulation of the passage of sun through the day. The client is a family of adults with teen children, so we chose to split the cabin into 2 portions separated by a deck, and that allows separation of family members, seasonal flux when a portion of the cabin might be occupied by fewer people, and anticipates future generational needs of the family where those children eventually go on to have families of their own and need a separate space for everyone to cohabitate together. The private program on the plan, shaded in gray, is at the top, the forested portion of the site, and you descend down to the social spaces closer to the water that are in white. As I said at the beginning, the site is approached from both directions, both from the forest, through by a meandering path, so cars can't actually enter the site, and by a beach access, which you see arriving from the top left corner of the page that meanders and is welcomed by the dropped decks that slowly bring it up to the social spaces. I'm now going to show a few images of this project, very recently completed. We completed this project 2 years ago. And these images I'm going to show illustrate that curated procession through the landscape into the house and ultimately to the water below. So on the left, you're seeing an image of when you first arrive on site and you're guided by an accessory building towards the meandering access path. And on the right, the arrival towards the entry door where you come in with a sort of oblique approach. Oh, sorry, something happened to this image, never mind. When you arrive at that deck positioned between the two portions of the house, your view is, you view back onto the mass landscape before you then turn right and enter the entry foyer that is illuminated and activated by that long rich beam skylight that I mentioned before. When you're in the main entry area, you see the skylight there above and views framed out to the mossy landscape. As you descend down into the social spaces below. Before arriving at those spaces, you have views framed out to the landscape again in a compressed area before you turn and come out into the social spaces with views towards Desolation Sound and the sunset. The image on the right shows the decks then further carrying you down towards the beach where you first meet an outdoor shower before you wind up and back into the house. And finally, these exterior views of the project show the building stitched into the landscape as it steps down towards the water. The second project I'm going to show is sited in a high meadow above a windswept bluff. This site has southeast exposure, so it's very hot in the summer months. And the site is characterized by a meadow on the south portion of the site and a forest in its rear. When we first arrived at the site, that meadow was covered in young shore pine and dead Sitka rose. And you'll see on the left side of the image a coast road that separates the site from the bluff just to the left of the frame. The first phase of occupation by the owners was to spend a season camping. We cleared the brush from the meadow portion of the site and set up a camping campsite for them. And this allowed the clients and us some time to get to know the site and to live informally outside. This season of occupation in this informal way then came to really influence how we approached the designs for the site. So this image shows a very early concept model. The conversation with the site became preoccupied with the heat and the sun and that meadow. We were interested in exploring formal ways to mediate that heat and create layers of respite from it by creating sheltered outdoor spaces for living. We were asked to master plan the site for a future build out, so the family was planning both for now and into the next generation. And that master plan involved a primary cabin, a secondary cabin, and an accessory building. In that wild and open space of the meadow, we organized the buildings to form a courtyard to define and hold the space. We brought in a road from the forest and used the accessory building positioned at the threshold between forest and meadow to create an entry to the site. The client only intended, however, to build the secondary cabin and the accessory building shown in the bottom right image for the present. So the siting of those two buildings had to also hold the site without the future main cabin, as it's unknown if it will ever be built. It's just planning for it. So that L configuration of buildings, while not a full courtyard, holds a space in between the two. This drawing, as with on the last project, shows a site plan with the interiors revealed at the top center portion of the page. On the left-hand side of the page are a series of cross-sections that move through the house. And on the bottom of the page is the site elevation. So all three of those drawings speak to how we've organized the cabins on the site. The building, the secondary cabin is rotated to prioritize views down Vancouver Island towards Hornby Island. And that allowed the long sides of the house to welcome the sunrise to the east and the late afternoon sun to the west. The spaces are organized in a rhythm of indoor and outdoor spaces, so as you occupy the site, you're constantly moving from outside to inside, to outside and in again. So with the suite of sections on the left-hand side of the page, it begins at a deep covered outdoor porch. The second section moves inside to a social space with a shade pergola extending out to the southwest. Then you move outside again to an outdoor corridor that brings you to the bathroom and bedrooms. And finally, at the end of the house is an outdoor bathroom completely exposed to nature. The accessory building, as I mentioned earlier, forms a kind of threshold entry onto the site, but it follows the same logic as the secondary cabin, where it's a series of outdoor and indoor spaces. So when you're inside that space, you're very connected to the landscape. We kept the buildings low to the ground, as you can see in the elevation, site elevation at the bottom of the page, so that as you transition from those outdoor spaces to the meadow, it's seamless. This next render of the project captures the spirit of the intent with this open air living on that meadow site. The next few images show the project completed. It was just completed last summer, so it's very fresh. The cedar is very bright, but the intent is that it will silver into the landscape. So this first image is the front porch that I mentioned, the deep covered front porch that feels like a contained outdoor room by closing up the gable end and framing the views to the meadow. This next image shows that interior social space that leads out into the shade pergola dining deck and shows the effect of light streaming through those slats into the interior. I should say this project we did in collaboration with Sophie Burke, so the interiors were done by Sophie's office. This next image shows that outdoor corridor that brings you from the social space to the private spaces. And the image on the right is in that same space looking in the opposite direction towards the social space. And finally, the last image is that outdoor, so there is an indoor bathroom with a toilet and a sink. And we tried to put a shower in it, but the client was really keen to have all bathing occur outdoors. And so we ran with it and even tried to put up a privacy screen, and they did not want it. So that is the bathroom, completely outdoors. And apparently even their shy guests love bathing up there. I think there's a problem with my next image, and I will not know what happened. It's bad. Apologies. These two images are of the accessory building. So the image on the right shows that framed kind of threshold entry onto the site, and the totally squashed image on the left is taken from that breezeway looking through the flexible room of the accessory building back out to the meadow beyond. And finally, this last image shows the project quietly situated in the meadow landscape. And as I mentioned, it's still to silver and season up, but the aim was to keep it discreet and set back in the land. Okay, the third and last project I'm going to speak about is one that's on the boards. It has been designed and construction will be starting imminently. This site is a forested site with mature fir, cedars, and arbutus. It is located on a peninsula that receives strong winds from both the northwest and the southeast. The site enjoys spectacular views of the sunset to the northwest in the summer months. And it's also situated, that peninsula has quite a steep bank to the water below. For this project, we were interested in having a conversation with the passage of light through the forest over the course of a day and over the course of a year. We wanted the project to interact with that dynamic play of light and shadow through the forest canopy. So our response, shown in this conceptual site plan at the bottom of the page and conceptual site elevation along the top of the page, was to think of the house as transparent to the forest on all sides, or at least the social space of the house, anchored by private spaces that are represented in black. The client for this house is an adult couple with grown children, adults themselves. So the desire was to keep the private spaces separated from one another and give everyone a bit of space to breathe. The top site section, conceptual site section, shows our response to the prevalent northwest winds by bowing the roof line down towards those winds and letting it come up and over the house. This conceptual sketch shows our intent and aim to create an interior space that felt like an outdoor room. A space which you could enjoy that passage of light through the forest throughout the day while still being sheltered inside. I'm so disappointed. The next slide is also distorted. I do not know what has happened other than at the last moment we moved the file and I think some images got messed up. So I want to apologize to Patrick Mella, who's the artist of this beautiful drawing, because this squashed render doesn't do it justice. So bear with me. It's a low, very low cabin. It is not weird. It's a beautiful drawing. I'm just gonna have to take my word for it. As the design developed, that idea of a transparent cabin in plan shifted to one of transparency in section. So what you see on, if you can make it out, is a very large south-facing skylight to celebrate the light coming through the forest canopy and to bring in southern light right through the building and to the north-facing deck in front. Facing the water, I'm so disappointed. Moving along. These two images are of a 16-inch site model. I should say physical models are our primary design tool in the office. So every project we explore first in physical model. Site model shows the main cabin there on the bottom left of the model, set back from the bank. And then an accessory building behind that we added to build in a layer of privacy between the cabin and those approaching from the road. The Kirby Bass line at the top of the model is the forest road that we actually moved deeper into the forest to build in another layer of privacy for the clients. As the design developed, so did our roof massing, and we tipped the back side of the roof towards the south to allow for that large south-facing skylight. And similarly, the accessory building has a similar asymmetrical gable, in that case prioritizing slope to the south for solar panels. This image shows, again, also the site plan where the interiors are revealed of both buildings. We maintain that concept of a transparent social space anchored by private spaces. As the plan developed, we organized the interior spaces in an L-shaped configuration around two deep covered decks or outdoor rooms. So the top right of the plan is a morning deck oriented to receive the sunrise and provide protection from the northwest winds. The bottom left of the cabin plan is a deep and generous deck facing the sunset, and also to provide protection from the southeast winds when they come from the other direction. We were also interested in providing long views of the ends of the building so that the passage of light through the forest could be experienced in the round. The accessory building, as I said, adds a layer of privacy to people approaching from the road, but by creating a breezeway in the center, that it also allows and frames views from the cabin back into the forest. The next two images are of a 1/4-inch model, so a slightly bigger scale model to give you a sense of how the design unfolded. This first image is of the east elevation of the house, showing the sunrise, the morning deck. And we employed a strategy of slatted walls enclosing those decks to make them feel like enclosed rooms, but also to play with this idea of slatted light coming through the forest canopy. This image is of the same model, now at the entry deck, looking in and right through the building. You also get a sense here of that deep, long skylight bringing south light right in through the whole floor plate of the cabin. And this final view of that model shows that deep cover deck oriented for the sunset and with that same slatted enclosure to mimic the slatted light coming through the forest. This closing image for this project is of that same 16-inch site model. Our aims with the other projects is to develop an architecture that's quiet and understated relative to the natural setting, but nonetheless delights in that natural setting. So I feel like we're very fortunate to work in these exquisite natural landscapes. It's our profound hope to make spaces for people that deeply connect them to the natural setting and allow them to delight in it. I'd like to thank my team for engaging in the aims of the studio, to our clients for their interest in creating unique homes and coming along the ride with us as we work through our design process, and to the builders that we work with who are coastal people themselves and share the values that we bring to our projects. Thank you.
Any questions?
Maybe I can just.
Sure.
So, you mentioned about invasive species in the landscape.
Oh, the ivy?
Ivy, that's what you showed. Just wondering what is the future of invasive species of the landscape? Is there like we're learning about relationships between what is foreign to the land that's thriving in its own way. Just wondering if invasiveness. It's also a matter of language, right? Because we're imposing language into nature. Like blackberry, for example, it's also a foreign invasive species, but we have a kind of a love-hate relationship with it. We eat its berry for food, for sustenance. Do you have to think about that?
Well, understand? Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. Okay.
We can talk more about this later, but, what we might think of invasive now very well might not be invasive later. In fact, what was considered invasive has now just become part of a lot of these biogeoclimatic zones specifically within the coastal western Hemlock forest. So, things change over time, but certainly within Pacific Spirit Park, you see, holly, the ivy, a number of other species that are just coming into the forest and overtaking a lot of what keeps the health of the forest there and alive. So there are certain implications of these invasive species at this time. More later.
Alyssa, I'll ask you a question since you've got the mic. Thanks for a very lyrical, beautifully written presentation. And here's a compliment. In many years of seeing this stuff, I've never once seen in the same presentation Andy Goldsworthy like lyrical, artistic, metaphysical investigation of a forest together with yellow stickies on a wall. So you got it. It's never been combined in the history of design. So good on you. Now my challenge to you, you've been in the woods, you've been in the forest.
I just came back today.
With your string and your documentation through photography, you're inquiring into those spaces and into their potentials and inquiring into your own perceptions of them. Okay, so there's a discipline that you've developed there. If I was a wealthy patron, I would give you a big bag of money with a challenge. Take your sensibility and apply it to the forest of Yaletown. By what means would you interpolate and investigate our urban forest? How could you take your investigation tools or different tools and investigate our urban forest of buildings?
Can I get back to you?
Yeah, you bet. Because it just strikes me that to change the terms, to have, I started thinking about, could there be landscape interventions on multiple towers, which would refer to each other, and would, there would be, whatever, lasers and who knows, maybe not. But could you do it with a made urban landscape?
Sure. Do you have buckets of money?
Okay. Okay, I'm passing the bucket. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I just kind of an inquiry. I'm first of all, I'm really interested. I'm a landscape architect by training. I'm currently working in the school system. So I'm really interested in when you talked about the connection or how children and people experience place and how that sort of progresses throughout their lives and it really informs them. That's the one question. The second part is just more of an inquiry because I also grew up in Manitoba. So to me, the landscape, the forest, infinitely reminds me very much of sort of the interlake landscape. And did you see that connection when you went there? Was sort of a second question because to me the nature of the ground plane, like of the ground cover versus the forest itself and the cover, spoke to me of that same landscape piece. First one was more about how we learn about landscape as children, how it informs us, and sort of if you could expand a bit more about the importance of that. And I'm also curious about your studies and what you did to further that.
I'm not a child specialist in terms of learning, but it's something Richard Love, anybody know that term? Speaks a lot about the relationship to landscape and nature. That it's really, it's a love of nature or a draw to nature is part of our DNA typically. But when you're a child, that's when that important relationship or connection to the natural world forms. If you are absent from nature as a child, I think you're losing something. You're losing part of understanding the world around you. Ultimately, I guess I think it asks all of us to look back at our own childhoods and think about our own connection to where we grew up, to our own landscapes, and just think about how they've left their mark on you as you've sort of continued through life. And maybe it's there always in your subconscious, or perhaps not. But for me, certainly, it's part of me. But I think, like I said, I just was never really taught to read landscape or to understand the value of what it's telling us. And I think that's really important as a child, is to learn from the landscape rather than just going for a walk, but really trying to understand what it's teaching us. Second question. I'm not a Manitoban. My experience of Winnipeg was the university, the dog park, and my partner. But there's beautiful urban forests in Winnipeg in particular. The problem with Winnipeg is that a lot of the landscapes are patchworks. They're not connected. And so, for instance, you have deer right in central Winnipeg, but they can't get anywhere else, so they're kind of landlocked in certain things. But I haven't spent enough time in Manitoba to maybe fully answer that question.
So does it remind you of Saskatchewan? All the same.
Are you specifically about Finland? Probably, if you think about northern Saskatchewan, probably it's a little bit more like that. We pine. So, it was so interesting being in Finland because it felt like home almost. It was funny, but maybe that was because of the nature of the forest itself.
I think that resonates.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks.
Any more questions? Yes.
Just one for Laura. I'm curious for a co-op island.
Co-op island, yeah.
Yeah, what's the process of erecting a new building? Is there a conversation? Do you throw a bunch of black and white photos of Sea Ranch and you're like, you have to, what's the control of the aesthetics, if there's any?
Oh, yeah, no, it's highly, no, it's highly controlled, but it's internally regulated. So it is within the Cathart Regional District, but like many of the regional districts, they don't have the capacity to require permits and send out inspectors. So in a lot of places up the coast, you just draw your drawings and hand them to the contractor. On Hernando, it's specifically regulated by a strict set of design guidelines. So the way the island was organized, the development was always restricted to 10% of the island, to the rest natural. And then the development that can take place is very limited in size and materiality, and just subjective, to be honest. So it's actually, you submit drawings in 3 stages to an internal governance board.
I'm thinking about the relationship between the two presentations.
And I was really curious and inspired by the Northwest Territories engagement related to well-being. So the question's for you, Laura. Okay. And it strikes me that the spatial work that you're doing is trying to encapsulate that, the well-being of these families. So I'm curious what kind of engagement, how do you go through engagement with your families that you're interpreting their values spatially? And what are your processes?
That's an interesting question. I mean, kind of further to the last question, I feel like my life was so influenced by being in that natural environment. And I know that that appreciation for the environment is shared by my clients, and they're choosing to build homes in these incredibly wild sites. So they're already on board in that way. They want a home where they are going to be, where they're going to be living deeply connected to nature. So the process is through a sort of deep reading of the site. Often clients, they don't know what they want. I mean, they know that they want, a house that has 4 bedrooms, or they need dining space or whatever, but it's kind of up to us to read the site and to bring them ideas about what we think is important about the site and how we propose that they to make a home that will engage them with the site. And honestly, I feel just very blessed for the clients that we've had so far, because they usually get pretty excited once you start to show them ideas about how you might situate them living in that landscape. But it's a long process. I mean, I think any residential work, you get into quite a deep and intimate relationship with your clients, as I'm sure some people in the audience know.
I have a question about building on these remote islands. There must be a lot of specific challenges, like getting materials not only to the island, but like to the sites themselves. Have you experienced any particular challenges in that, or like?
Yeah, very much. I mean, the time for the talk was quite limited, so I decided to not go into it. I mean, I think it's a super exciting part of the work. It's just the logistics are bananas. Yeah. Much of the logistics are for the contractor, of course, to actually work out, but you can't design and build on an island like that without taking those logistics into consideration. So, for example, in the first house, the road access was very limited. So, as with many houses on that island anyway, we had to really limit the amount of concrete we could use, because they were hand mixing up on site and carrying it to create each footing. So that became a strategy of point footings, and as minimal concrete walls as required. But the whole operation of building on remote sites is kind of amazing, and the builders that we work with, they, like I mentioned, they're coast people, and so they have systems to actually deal with the logistics. They're used to it. But yeah, it involves typically, so many of the projects are on islands with no ferry access. So typically the materials are brought up the coast, loaded into a barge. The barge comes over to the island, and then we often actually use helicopters to pick the building materials from the barge and deposit it on the site. Partly just for time, in the interest of time, and like less wear and tear on the crew and on the trucks. And sometimes it's just the only way it can be done. Say we brought in steel, we actually placed steel beams for a project with a helicopter, because it was just logistically impossible to lift them out of the barge onto a truck, etc. Yeah. That's a big part of it for sure.
What would you say the main differences are between like your original iterations and the final product? And like in a sense, what would you say your architecture becomes like?
I think so much can happen in the process of design, from how you wish a project to be to how it becomes. I think the projects that start with a strong, clear idea of what we want to do, even though the design might develop and become more complex, we can try to stay true to an original idea. We try to do that with each project, which can get tricky when it's a bigger house or a bigger development, to try to keep that conceptual clarity. And for sure there are compromises along the way, just to say with building logistics, or I don't know, it's hard to be like, sometimes to always see it as clearly as you want to at the beginning, but that's always the intent. Yeah. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
Obviously, these sites are so beautiful, and I'm just wondering if you have any advice for people that are maybe working with sites that are a lot more restrictive and don't, you know, have such a wild nature to them. Is there a way, or do you have any advice to bring that sentiment into, say, Yaletown or Vancouver, or, you know, somewhere that we don't necessarily have such a wild connection to nature, but not everybody can afford, obviously, to go to an island or build on a site like this? Is there a way to bring that sentiment into different work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the privilege of working in a beautiful natural site is you put a window. It's already amazing to see the window because already the views are amazing. But I think for me, a lot of the interest is actually playing with light. So I think, although I haven't worked in an urban context for some years now, I feel like that would be the advice I would give. Like, what can you do with the constraints that you have? Where can you find opportunities for delight? And it's going to take a different form in an urban condition, but that's, I feel like light is as delightful a medium to work in as a natural setting, and that might be, I mean, for me, it's a priority in every project, even though there's also the exquisite views. It's actually playing with light and the passage of light as a kind of marker of time.
You showed Charles and Turnbull's Sea Ranch, and I think rightly so, as a kind of philosophical source. I was lucky enough to do a studio with them, and they took us up there. And Charles walked us around the condo, and all he talked about was the value of dumb plans.
Oh, yeah.
That architects, especially young architects and students, overwork and overwrought their plans and have dead simple sections and no elevations, okay? In other words, it all goes into the plan.
Right.
And if you look at that condo, a lot of it's in sections, the EDQ and stuff inside. Now, your first house was one of the most elaborate plans I've ever seen of a BC house. Virtually every room was on a different plan alignment, and I know it's going up and down off the rocks, but very, very elaborate and worked out plans. But your elevations and your roofs are very simple. They're almost extruded. I'm just looking ahead. Do you think you take that same discipline of plan that you have will come to elaborate elevations, roofs, sections, or is the plan enough?
I would say I'm more interested in exploring that same complexity in section than elevation. I really do enjoy keeping buildings, like with the aspiration of keeping buildings quiet. I'm not particularly interested in complex roof lines, unless there's a purpose. That's certainly not as a formal agenda. I do love the plan, I will tell you. But I also, for me, that first house with the complex floor plan, I like to think it is very interesting to move through the section because you're constantly negotiating small level changes or split level changes. So the experience of moving through that house is a sectional experience to me. And similarly with the last, so this middle project, very simple. It was truly about extruding a gable and then carving out voids to create outdoor rooms. But the last project, although simple building form, we were delighting in its sectional qualities with light. So not formal moves with the roof, but with the play of light. I feel like I probably talked too much, or it's 20 past 7.
We're way over.
We're out of here at 7, right?
Yeah, we're good.
I mean, I can talk all night.
Thank you again very much, Alyssa and Laura, and thanks everyone for coming out, and have a good night.